At 4 in the morning, on the 16th of August, the silence of the West African night was broken by the rumble of 57 trucks. They moved slowly, headlights dimmed, shadows rolling along the back roads of Burkina Faso. At first glance, they seemed like humanitarian convoys. Sacks piled high, crates sealed shut. But what they carried was not rice, nor medicine, nor relief. Beneath the canvas tarps lay rifles, rockets, and death. This was no accident. It was no petty crime. It was betrayal disguised as aid. And if those trucks had crossed into the capital, the very soil of Burkina Faso might have burned. Yet standing against it was a young soldier turned leader, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. He did not hesitate. He saw what others hoped to ignore: the hand of foreign powers reaching once again for Africa's throat. But who paid for this arsenal? Who planned a billion-dollar war in the shadows? And why Burkina Faso? Stay with us and see how God carries this story forward. Because this is not the story of one person or of one nation. It is the story of an entire continent reclaiming its voice. Subscribe and raise your voice for an Africa that stands tall and rise. If your heart says yes, type it loud in the comments. United Africa forever. Amen. The borderlands of Canari, near the line that separates Burkina Faso from Togo, are usually silent at night. Farmers rest after long days in the fields. Traders retreat to their homes. Only the sound of crickets and the occasional bark of a dog cuts through the darkness. But on that night, the 16th of August, 2025, the silence was broken. Captain Moussa Kabore, commander of the border patrol, was on duty. His men were used to spotting smugglers carrying contraband fuel or stolen livestock, not much more. But when the first outlines of a massive convoy appeared in the distance, Moussa's instincts told him something was wrong. Trucks, dozens of them, were crawling along the dirt track, headlights dim, engines humming low. It was 4 o'clock in the morning. No aid group, no honest trader, moved cargo at such an hour. Kabore radioed to his superiors, his voice sharp but steady. "This convoy, it is not normal." At the presidential compound in Ouagadougou, the alert reached Ibrahim Traoré himself. Unlike so many leaders who would have waited, delayed, or pushed the decision onto others, Captain Ibrahim did not hesitate. He picked up the phone and called General Ibrahim Zerbo, commander of the Special Forces. His words were clear: "Intercept that convoy. Secure it, but be careful. We do not yet know what we are dealing with." Within minutes, Zerbo's men were on the move. Black-clad units of the Special Forces fanned out through the scrubland, setting up ambush points along the convoy's path. Drones hovered silently above, feeding live images to command. Helicopters lifted off from a nearby base, their rotors slicing the night air, ready to cut off any escape. The trap was set. At precisely 4 a.m., as the trucks snaked into a narrow stretch of road bordered by thorn bushes, the first barricade slammed shut. Lights blazed. Armed men poured from the shadows. Drivers panicked, slamming their brakes, some trying to reverse. But the road behind was blocked. Within minutes, the convoy was encircled. One by one, the drivers were dragged from their cabins. Some shouted in confusion, insisting they were delivering aid. Others kept silent, their eyes fixed on the ground. The soldiers worked methodically, prying open the first truck. Beneath the sacks of grain was not food, but iron. Black steel rifles stacked like firewood. An officer shouted into his radio, his voice heavy with disbelief. "Mr. President, you won't believe this. The trucks are packed with weapons. And it was not just one truck. The second, the third, the 10th, all the same. Crates of AK-47s, boxes of M16 rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, ammunition belts coiled like serpents. Enough firepower to equip an entire army." In that moment, Captain Kabore and his men understood the truth. This was no smuggling run. This was a war convoy, disguised in sacks of grain, rolling silently toward the heart of Burkina Faso. The drivers were lined up under the beam of searchlights. Their faces were pale, their hands trembling. Some claimed they knew nothing, that they had been told they were carrying farm equipment. Perhaps it was true. But the masterminds behind this operation knew exactly what was on board. By dawn, the trucks were secured, their cargo catalogued under heavy guard. The operation that began in silence had ended in a thunderclap. Burkina Faso had just stumbled upon one of the largest arms seizures in African history. And it was only the beginning. The first light of dawn revealed a scene that stunned even the most hardened soldiers. On a dusty road in Canari, 57 trucks stood silent, their tarpaulins peeled back, their hidden cargo spilling into the open. It was no longer rumor, no longer suspicion. It was a full-blown arsenal exposed under the African sun. The inventory shocked everyone. 25,000 AK-47 rifles stacked in crates, their wooden stocks polished, their barrels glinting as though fresh from the factory. 10,000 American-made M16 rifles, bundled with precision. 13 million rounds of ammunition packed in metal boxes, each stamped with foreign markings. 70,000 hand grenades, small but deadly, their pins neatly lined. 2,500 rocket launchers, the kind used in wars across the Middle East. 400 anti-aircraft missiles, weapons capable of bringing down planes, weapons no ordinary rebel group could dream of acquiring. And at the very back, buried under sacks of rice and maize, 50 tons of explosives, enough to flatten entire neighborhoods. When the numbers were read aloud in the Security Council, General Sadou, the Minister of Defense, slammed his fist on the table. His words echoed through the chamber. With this firepower, you could invade an entire country. Interior Minister Hussein Traoré added grimly, if even a fraction of this had reached the wrong hands, Burkina Faso would not be standing today. We would be drowning in blood. Terror groups would carve our land into pieces. And worse, a coup could have unfolded in our own capital. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, each official struggling to comprehend the scale of the plot. President Ibrahim Traoré listened, then rose to his feet. His voice was measured but firm. This is not random smuggling. This is not a petty crime. This is a war waiting to be unleashed on our soil. Someone, somewhere, is preparing to turn Burkina Faso into the next Libya, the next Syria, the next Yemen. But we caught them before they struck. Intelligence officers immediately began tracing the weapons. Many of the serial numbers had been deliberately filed off. But forensic experts worked through the night, piecing together fragments. What they found painted a disturbing picture. Some of the rifles were leftovers from the Libyan civil war, weapons that had flooded the black markets after the fall of Muammar Gaddafi. Others had been used in the brutal conflict in Yemen. Still others were brand new, straight from European factories, never fired, still coated in industrial grease. The estimated value of the entire cache, more than $700 million. That figure alone raised questions far larger than Burkina Faso. Who had that kind of money? What foreign backers were investing in chaos? And for what purpose? Traoré knew the answer would not come easily. Arms smugglers did not work on this scale without political patrons. Someone powerful was pulling the strings. Someone who believed they could destabilize his nation and get away with it. Meanwhile, news of the seizure began to leak. Soldiers stationed at the site whispered to their families. By midday, the story was spreading in Ouagadougou. 57 trucks seized, packed with weapons. Crowds gathered outside government buildings demanding answers. Radio stations buzzed with speculation. Had terrorists planned an attack? Was a neighboring country behind it? Or was this the work of foreign powers who had long meddled in Africa's affairs? By evening, one thing was certain. Burkina Faso was staring at a plot far greater than anyone had imagined. The arsenal was not just a threat to the nation's security. It was proof that invisible hands were trying to script its downfall. In his private chambers, President Traoré looked again at the photographs of the seized weapons. Rifles lined up like rows of silent soldiers. Rocket launchers stacked high like firewood. Missiles that could pierce the sky. He whispered to himself, "They thought we would be asleep, but we are wide awake." For 2 days, the captured drivers were interrogated. Most swore they knew nothing. They said they had been told the trucks carried agricultural machinery, spare parts, and aid supplies bound for Togo. Their fear seemed genuine, their hands trembling as they signed their statements. But then came the breakthrough. One man, a businessman named Francois Bongo, cracked under the pressure. He was not just a driver, he was a coordinator, a link in the chain. His confession hit like a thunderclap. This, he stammered, was never about smuggling. It was a plan to overthrow President Ibrahim Traoré. They called it Operation Restored Democracy. The room fell silent. Investigators leaned forward as Bongo laid it all out. The conspirators had met in secret months earlier. Some meetings were held in Accra, others in Abidjan. The instructions, however, came from further afield, from Paris and from Washington. The scheme was meticulous. First, stage terrorist attacks across Burkina Faso, spreading fear and panic. Then, use that chaos to mobilize opposition groups already bitter against the government. With the streets burning, traitors within the army would move. The goal was simple: topple Traoré and install a regime loyal not to the people of Burkina Faso, but to foreign powers. Bongo named names: former ministers, retired generals, wealthy businessmen, and, most shockingly, diplomats who carried foreign passports, but were no true diplomats at all. They had blended into the capital under the guise of international organizations, quietly laying the groundwork for the coup. One officer interrupted. "Do you mean to say foreign governments were behind this?" Bongo hesitated, his lips dry. Then he whispered, "Yes. Without them, there would be no weapons, no money, no plan." Documents seized from laptops and phones confirmed his words. Bank transfers traced to accounts in Europe and the Gulf. Emails encrypted but cracked by intelligence teams. Lists of warehouses in Ouagadougou where the weapons were to be stored before distribution. This was no loose network of smugglers. It was a state-level operation dressed in shadows. When President Traoré was briefed, he leaned back in his chair, his face hard. "So they believe," he said slowly, "that Africa can still be puppeteered, that Burkina Faso will bow as others have bowed." Then he stood. "They are wrong. This is the line they will not cross." He ordered simultaneous raids in the capital. 23 warehouses were stormed. 17 were filled with weapons. The arrests were shocking. Men who had once sworn loyalty to the nation, men who had dined in the halls of government, men who now stood exposed as traitors. Yet the most damning evidence was not the weapons nor the arrests, but the plan itself. Operation Restored Democracy carried a staggering budget, $700 million for its first phase. The 57 trucks were only the beginning. More shipments were planned, more chaos prepared. The scale revealed something undeniable. This was not about Burkina Faso alone. It was about a strategy to destabilize the entire Sahel, to break the chain of independence that countries like Mali, Niger, Guinea, and Burkina Faso had begun to forge. And at the center of the storm stood one man, young, unflinching, unwilling to kneel, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. For the first time, his supporters and his enemies alike realized this was not just a president. He was becoming a symbol, a reminder that Africa's struggle against imperialism was far from over. The hidden hand had been revealed, but Traoré knew this was only the beginning of the fight. 3 days after the seizure, the people of Burkina Faso gathered around radios, televisions, and phones. A special broadcast had been announced, one that promised revelations. In the capital, journalists from across the world crowded into the press hall. The air was electric. Everyone wanted to hear directly from the young captain who had stopped 57 trucks of death. When President Ibrahim Traoré entered, he did not come alone. Behind him stood soldiers in full uniform, and towering behind them, stacked high for the cameras, were the captured weapons. Rifles lined like endless rows of iron. Rocket launchers stacked in pyramids. Grenades piled into crates. It was a mountain of steel and fire, now frozen, neutralized, under the guard of the state. Traoré stepped to the podium. His voice was calm, but his words struck with force. My fellow Burkinabe, and to the international community watching today. 3 days ago, our forces intercepted the largest weapons smuggling operation in our history. But let me be clear, this was not smuggling. This was an attempt to destroy our country from within. He held up a folder of documents, stamped and sealed. Here is the proof. 57 trucks, over $700 million worth of arms. Their goal? To plunge our land into chaos. To pit Burkinabe against Burkinabe. And to replace your government with one that bows to foreign masters. The room went silent. Then his voice hardened. Some of these weapons came from Libya, others from Yemen. Some were fresh, straight from factories in NATO countries. Do not be deceived. Imperialist powers still believe they can pull Africa's strings. They are wrong. We are no longer asleep. We are wide awake. Journalists erupted with questions. CNN demanded, which countries are behind this? Traoré answered, measured, the investigation continues. But already, we know, these weapons are not African. They were manufactured elsewhere. They were sent here with intent. BBC pressed, who are the masterminds? Traoré replied firmly, 17 individuals have been arrested. Former ministers, retired generals, wealthy businessmen. Informants are speaking. The truth is coming. Al Jazeera asked, how will this affect regional security? Traoré's reply was clear. This is not an attack on Burkina Faso alone. This is an attack on all of Africa. Similar plots are unfolding in Mali, in Niger, in Guinea. We must unite or we will fall divided. Then came a symbolic act that no one would forget. Soldiers wheeled in a massive iron cauldron. Before the cameras, before his people, Traoré took one of the captured rifles, raised it for all to see, and dropped it into the fire. The crowd gasped as the metal melted, glowing red in the furnace. He declared, these weapons were meant to kill our children. Instead, we will melt them down to build schools, hospitals, and irrigation canals. From tools of death, we will forge tools of life. The crowd outside erupted in chants. Young men beat drums. Women ululated in triumph. Elderly men wept, tears running down wrinkled cheeks. For them, this was not just politics. It was history unfolding, a promise of a different future. Then, with the eyes of the world upon him, Traoré ended with words that would echo beyond Burkina Faso. We are the grandchildren of Thomas Sankara. We will not kneel. Not today, not tomorrow, not ever. And in that moment, Captain Ibrahim was no longer just a president. He was a voice for an entire continent. The images of President Ibrahim Traoré standing before a mountain of seized weapons spread across the world like wildfire. In Paris, Washington, and London, officials scrambled to draft statements. In Moscow, Beijing, Ankara, and Caracas, leaders sent messages of solidarity. The young captain from Ouagadougou had not only exposed a plot against his country, he had dragged a global conspiracy into the light. Western governments were quick to react, but their tone betrayed unease. Spokespersons called for the release of foreign nationals arrested in Burkina Faso, some of whom carried diplomatic passports. These individuals are protected by international law, one European minister insisted. But Traoré was unflinching. Diplomatic passports, he replied, do not give you permission to commit crimes on our soil. His defiance electrified supporters across Africa. While the West threatened economic sanctions, others took a different stance. Russia declared that Traoré had every right to defend his country. China went further, offering to donate advanced security equipment. Turkey called arms smuggling a crime against humanity. Iran condemned what it called neo-colonial plots. And in Venezuela, President Nicolas Maduro praised Traoré directly. Brother Ibrahim is today's Simon Bolivar, a hero of the anti-imperialist struggle. But the shockwaves did not stop at diplomacy. Investigators, working with Interpol, traced financial trails behind the plot. Transfers worth nearly $1 billion ran through shell companies in Europe, the Gulf, and offshore havens. The deeper they dug, the clearer it became. This was not the work of a handful of rogue businessmen. It was systemic, organized, international. Across the Sahel, neighboring governments watched with alarm. In Mali, Colonel Assimi Goïta warned his citizens that similar schemes might already be in motion. In Niger, General Abdourahmane Chiani ordered a review of border security. Guinea's leadership announced a crackdown on suspected foreign-funded NGOs. Burkina Faso's stand had emboldened its allies to prepare. Inside Burkina Faso, the revelations transformed public opinion. Crowds flooded Independence Square, chanting Traoré's name, waving banners that read, "Africa will never kneel again." Young people shouted that this was the birth of a new era. Elders compared the moment to the speeches of Thomas Sankara in the 1980s. At a second press conference, Traoré spoke with fire. "The masks are off," he declared. "They wrote lists of ministers before toppling our government. They divided up our resources before touching our soil. But they forgot one thing: the people of Burkina Faso. We own this land, not them." His words rippled beyond his borders, striking chords in Lagos, Dakar, and Johannesburg. The symbolism reached its peak when the government announced that August 16th would be commemorated each year as National Awakening and Victory Day. Schools across Burkina Faso would teach the story, not as myth, but as living history. Weapons of war would be melted, recast into school bells, irrigation pipes, and hospital equipment. And each morning, when children heard the bell ring, it would not just mark the start of class. It would echo a message that death had been transformed into life. International observers admitted it was unprecedented. A United Nations representative called it the first time in African history that weapons of war were openly converted into instruments of peace. The African Union envoy declared, "This is not just Burkina Faso's victory. This is Africa's awakening." But even as the celebrations swelled, the question loomed: how long before those who had been exposed tried again? The conspiracy was global, the money immense, the ambitions deep. Yet Traoré stood resolute. "They thought they could frighten us into submission," he said. "Instead, they have awakened us." For the people of Burkina Faso, the seizures were no longer just about 57 trucks. They were about a turning point, a line in the sand, a declaration that Africa would not be puppeteered forever. And to the viewers listening across the ocean, far from Ouagadougou, Traoré's message rang just as true: that dignity is worth more than gold, that independence is not for sale, and that unity remains Africa's greatest weapon. Let my people go. Say it loud. Let Africa rise. The seizure of 57 trucks on that August morning was more than a security operation. It was a declaration that the old games of intimidation, bribery, and manipulation would no longer succeed on African soil. For centuries, foreign powers had armed wars in Africa, hidden behind promises of democracy and aid. But in the dust of Canari, with rifles piled like mountains and rockets stacked like firewood, Captain Ibrahim Traoré shattered that illusion. This victory was not measured only in the weapons seized. It was measured in the hope it ignited. From Ouagadougou to Bamako, from Niamey to Conakry, ordinary people saw something they had long dreamed of: leaders willing to confront the hidden hand and say no. Burkina Faso's latest news was no longer about instability, but about resistance, unity, and the power of a people who refused to bow. When Traoré promised that those weapons would be melted into school bells, hospital beds, and irrigation canals, he offered more than symbolism. He offered a vision that Africa's greatest battles would not be fought with bullets, but with books, medicine, and water. That is the future our ancestors prayed for, the future our grandchildren deserve. The foreign powers may still plot. Their networks may still move money in the shadows. But the people of Burkina Faso have seen the truth, and once a people awaken, they do not return to sleep. So let this story echo not only in West Africa, but across the world. Let it be remembered that on the 16th of August, a young captain stood tall and turned an arsenal of death into a beacon of life. Are you ready to speak up when silence feels safer? To stand tall when it's easier to bow? The headlines about Captain Ibrahim will change tomorrow. But one thing will remain. The dignity of Africa is not up for negotiation. Say it loud in the comments. Africa rise. God bless Africa and Burkina Faso. Don't let silence erase our voice. Amen. Every comment is a reminder that we're still here, that justice still stands, and it cannot be erased. Because Africa is not just catching up. We are building our own systems from the smallest acts on our own terms. Thank you for standing with us here. We'll see you in the next chapter. A chapter they wanted hidden. But we will never let that happen.